The house was quiet, but Malcolm's heart pounded like a war drum. The blood on his hands had begun to dry, dark and unforgiving. His father's lifeless eyes stared back at him, frozen in that mocking smirk. The final insult in a lifetime of deception. The weight of his actions pressed down. But there was no relief, no sense of justice, only the realization that there was no turning back. Outside, the distant hum of sirens grew louder. The reckoning had come. But was it punishment or salvation? Before we begin this powerful story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and let us know where you're watching from. The sun bathed the small Alabama town in golden light as Malcolm Carter stepped out onto the porch of his house, Bible in hand. The morning air was crisp, filled with the sound of birds singing and the distant chatter of children walking to school. His heart swelled with gratitude as he looked inside through the open door where Vanessa was setting the breakfast table. Their 5 children hurried around, laughing and arguing over the last piece of toast. It was moments like these that made all the hard work worth it, the endless hours spent at the church, the sacrifices, the prayers. He had built a life of faith, love, and honor, and he carried that pride with him every day. At the breakfast table, Malcolm led the family in prayer, his deep voice steady and filled with conviction. The children bowed their heads, their small voices murmuring in unison. Vanessa watched her husband with admiration, her hands folded neatly on the table. This was their foundation, their anchor. Franklin Carter, Malcolm's father, had always taught him that a man's strength came from his faith and the family he nurtured. Malcolm had spent his entire life honoring that lesson, building a home where God came first. The children knew the rules: truth, respect, and obedience. But above all, they knew they were loved. After breakfast, Jasmine, their eldest, lingered at the table, her dark eyes bright with curiosity. She pulled out a paper from her school folder, tapping it excitedly. It was an assignment about genealogy, a simple DNA test to trace family heritage. Vanessa froze for a second, so briefly that no one else seemed to notice. Franklin, who had stopped by for his usual morning coffee, barely lifted his gaze from his cup. Malcolm chuckled, ruffling Jasmine's hair, saying it would be interesting to see where their roots traced back to. It was harmless, a fun project, a way for the children to learn more about their history. Vanessa's hands trembled slightly as she gathered the plates, her breath unsteady. She felt Malcolm's gentle touch on her back as he leaned in, whispering that everything was fine. But deep inside, she knew it wasn't. She avoided Franklin's gaze, but she could feel it on her, heavy and suffocating. He stirred his coffee slowly, a calculated movement, a silent warning. The air in the room shifted, and for the first time in years, Vanessa felt like the walls were closing in. She had spent so long pretending, so long holding it all together, that she almost believed it was real. Almost. Outside, Malcolm kissed Vanessa's forehead before heading to the church, his steps steady, his mind clear. He was a man with purpose, with faith. His life was perfect, his family untouchable. Yet behind him, Vanessa stood in the doorway, her hands gripping the fabric of her dress. She watched him walk away, swallowed by the light of the morning sun, and she wondered how much longer she could keep the truth buried. Franklin sat at the table, finishing his coffee, his expression unreadable. He said nothing, but he didn't have to. The weight of what was coming pressed against Vanessa's chest, an invisible force that made it hard to breathe. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Jasmine excitedly talked about her DNA test, explaining how it worked and how easy it was. The younger children giggled, eager to discover something new about themselves. Malcolm smiled at their enthusiasm, but he noticed how Vanessa avoided his gaze. He noticed how Franklin remained unusually quiet. A chill passed through him, brief but unsettling. He shook it off. There was no reason to worry. Everything was as it should be. Vanessa forced a smile, laughing at something Noah said, but her heart pounded in her chest. She had spent years keeping the past locked away, hidden behind smiles and quiet prayers. But some truths refused to stay buried. Some secrets clawed their way to the surface, no matter how hard one tried to keep them in the dark. And as Jasmine placed the DNA test kit on the table, The first crack in their perfect world began to show. The days passed quickly, and soon the DNA test results arrived. Jasmine ripped open the envelope at the kitchen table, her siblings gathering around in excitement. Malcolm smiled as he watched them, amused by their curiosity. Vanessa stood at the counter, her hands gripping the edge of the sink, her knuckles white. She could barely hear their laughter over the pounding of her own heart. Franklin sat in his usual chair, silent, his face unreadable. The moment the results were pulled from the envelope, the room buzzed with anticipation. Jasmine read aloud, her voice bright and full of wonder. She listed the origins, West Africa, parts of Europe, even traces of Native American ancestry. The children marveled at their findings, passing the paper around, pointing and giggling. But Malcolm's excitement faded the moment he glanced at the document. Something was wrong. His eyes scanned the words again, his pulse quickening. His gaze flicked to the section labeled Paternal Lineage. A cold weight settled in his stomach. His name was nowhere on the page. Confusion washed over him, followed by disbelief. He shook his head, forcing a chuckle. There had to be a mistake. DNA tests weren't always accurate, right? He took the document from Jasmine's hands, reading it again, slower this time. His breath caught in his throat. The listed paternal match was a close relative. His chest tightened. A mistake, he told himself again. That was the only explanation. He turned to Vanessa, expecting her to laugh it off, to reassure him. But she wasn't laughing. She wasn't saying anything at all. The silence stretched between them, like a noose tightening around his neck. He looked at Franklin, but his father remained still, staring into his coffee as if nothing had happened. Malcolm's hands trembled as he placed the papers down. He had to be wrong. Maybe the test company made an error. Maybe there was some technical mistake. His mind raced, desperate for a reasonable explanation. He needed to confirm. He needed certainty. That night, long after the children had gone to bed, Malcolm sat in his office, phone in hand. His voice was steady as he spoke to the DNA testing company, demanding answers. He needed them to check, to reanalyze, to fix whatever mistake had been made. The representative on the line was calm, professional. They reassured him that their process was thorough. Their results were verified multiple times. But when they repeated the findings, Malcolm felt the ground beneath him crack. The children were not his. Not a single one. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. His hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms. He stood in the dimly lit room, his world collapsing in slow motion. His entire life, his marriage, his faith, his family, was a lie. He turned toward the hallway, where Vanessa stood in the shadows, her face pale, her eyes filled with something between guilt and fear. His voice was barely above a whisper when he asked the only question that mattered. Who? Vanessa's lips parted, but no words came out. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as she stared at Malcolm, her eyes pleading, searching for something. Understanding, mercy, anything. But Malcolm felt nothing but the slow, burning rise of rage in his veins. The weight of her silence was worse than any confession. His mind spun, grasping at explanations, at justifications, at any reason that would make this nightmare less real. He stepped forward, his voice low and sharp. Tell me who? His fingers curled at his sides, his body rigid with tension. Vanessa shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. She covered her mouth, as if holding back a scream, but her silence only deepened his fury. Tell me, he repeated, his tone no longer pleading. It was a command. Franklin's voice sliced through the tension. That's enough. He stood from the kitchen table, slow and deliberate, his presence heavy in the room. His calmness was unnerving. Malcolm turned to him, the realization hitting him like a hammer to the chest. The blood drained from his face. Franklin didn't look away. He didn't even flinch. Malcolm staggered back as if struck. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind struggling to process the horror unraveling before him. No, it wasn't possible. His father, his mentor, his guiding force, was the monster. The children, his beautiful, innocent children, were not his. They were Franklin's. His stomach twisted, bile rising in his throat. He clenched his hands, his nails biting into his skin. His mind replayed years of memories. Franklin's presence in their home, his influence over Vanessa, the way she had always seemed to shrink in his presence. It had been right in front of him all along, and he had been too blind, too trusting, too foolish to see it. Vanessa sobbed, crumbling onto the floor. "I didn't know how to stop it," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I was trapped. I was scared." She covered her face, shoulders trembling. "I tried to keep them safe. I tried—" "Stop." Malcolm's voice was cold, emotionless. He couldn't hear her. He wouldn't. His entire body shook, every muscle coiled with unspent rage. He turned away, grabbing his coat from the chair. He needed to leave before he did something irreversible. His entire life had collapsed within minutes, and he couldn't breathe inside that house anymore. He stormed out into the night, his feet carrying him down the empty streets, his vision blurred with fury and heartbreak. The wind howled around him, but it was nothing compared to the storm inside his chest. The church, the faith, the life he had built. It was all meaningless now. His father had stolen everything. His hands clenched into fists. This wasn't over. This would never be over. The house was silent when Malcolm returned. The air inside felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of the truth. He stepped through the doorway, his movements slow, calculated. His mind was a storm, a chaotic swirl of rage, grief, and something darker, something irreversible. Vanessa sat at the dining table, her face streaked with dried tears, her hands folded in her lap. She had been waiting. The children were asleep upstairs, unaware that the world beneath them was crumbling. Her eyes met Malcolm's, and for a brief moment she searched for the man she had once known. But he was gone. The man standing before her was someone else entirely. He pulled out a chair across from her, his jaw clenched. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was steady, too steady. Vanessa flinched at the sound of it. She opened her mouth, but no answer came. How could she explain years of silence? How could she make him understand that fear had chained her, that she had spent every moment of their marriage trying to protect their children from the truth? Malcolm exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "I could have helped you," he muttered. "I could have—" His voice caught, and for the first time it wavered. Vanessa saw the pain, raw and unfiltered, but it lasted only a second before the anger swallowed it whole. "You let me love them." His voice was quieter now, but no less dangerous. "You let me believe they were mine." He shook his head. "And you let him take everything." Vanessa's face twisted in anguish. "I had no choice," she whispered. "You don't know what he's capable of. You don't know." Malcolm slammed his fist against the table, rattling the glasses. "Don't make excuses for him," he growled. "Don't you dare." His breathing was heavy, uneven. He could hear his pulse pounding in his ears. The betrayal, the lies, the years stolen from him. It was too much. Vanessa's eyes darted to the kitchen counter, where a knife rested near the cutting board. Malcolm followed her gaze, and something inside him shifted. Slowly, deliberately, he stood and walked toward it. She rose from her seat, but she didn't move fast enough. His fingers curled around the handle of the knife. It felt cold, familiar, an extension of the storm inside him. Vanessa backed away, shaking her head, hands raised. "Please," she whispered. Malcolm's grip tightened. He had spent his entire life believing in justice, in righteousness. He had preached about forgiveness, about letting God carry the burdens too heavy for men. But where was God now? Where was justice? Something inside him snapped. The blade cut through the air before Vanessa could scream. Her body jerked, her hands grasping at nothing. Blood bloomed across her dress, spreading like ink on paper. She gasped, eyes wide, but there were no words left. She collapsed to the floor, her breaths coming in ragged, broken sobs. Malcolm stood over her, the knife still in his grip, his chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. He had thought it would bring relief, that the pain would ease. But it didn't. The house remained just as silent, just as heavy. Only now there was the scent of blood in the air, the sound of Vanessa's final breath slipping away. And it still wasn't enough. Malcolm's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the leather. The metallic scent of blood clung to his clothes, his skin, his very soul. The car rumbled down the dark road, each streetlight casting fleeting shadows across his face. The world outside blurred, but his mind was razor-sharp, fixed on one thing. Franklin. His father's house loomed ahead, a grand structure that had always felt too cold, too hollow despite its size. Malcolm pulled into the driveway, his breath shallow, controlled. The rage inside him no longer burned. It had settled into something deeper, something deadly. He stepped out of the car, moving with purpose. The knife was still in his grip. The blood on it dried now, dark and unforgiving. He didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open, stepping into the dimly lit house. Franklin sat in his favorite armchair as if he had been expecting him. The old man's gaze lifted lazily from the drink in his hand. A slow smile curled his lips. "You're finally seeing things clearly," Franklin murmured, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Took you long enough." Malcolm's breath hitched. The calmness in his father's voice twisted the knife already buried deep in his chest. He threw the DNA results onto the coffee table. The pages fluttered before settling, undeniable proof of the horror Franklin had created. Malcolm's voice was hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "Explain this." Franklin leaned back, studying his son. His smirk never faded. "You already know the answer." He took a sip of his drink, unbothered, unashamed. "I did what I wanted, and she let me." Malcolm lunged. The glass shattered against the floor, as Franklin barely managed to push himself from the chair in time. They crashed against the table, papers scattering, the dull thud of fists meeting flesh filling the room. Malcolm's vision blurred with fury, his fists landing blow after blow. The years of trust, of love, of blind faith had been nothing but a lie. Franklin coughed, blood pooling at the corner of his lips. Yet he still laughed. A rasping, wheezing sound. "You're just like me," he croaked. "That's what scares you the most." Malcolm froze, his chest heaving. The knife felt heavier in his grip, as if it carried the weight of all the years he had been a fool. Franklin's breath was uneven now, his smirk fading, but his eyes held no fear. He thought he had won. He thought his legacy would continue, twisted and poisoned through Malcolm. But Malcolm was not his father. His grip tightened around the knife. He drove it forward. Franklin gasped, his body jerking. The smirk vanished, replaced by wide, glassy eyes. Malcolm didn't stop. Every strike was a release, every cut a wound that Franklin had placed on his soul, his family, his life. The old man fell limp, his body slumping to the floor in a lifeless heap. Malcolm staggered back, his chest rising and falling in short, ragged breaths. The silence of the house was deafening. He stared at the body, waiting for the relief, for the satisfaction, for something. But there was nothing. He was still drowning. Malcolm stepped back, his breath heavy, his hands slick with his father's blood. The house was silent now, except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He looked down at the lifeless body sprawled on the floor. The once powerful man, now nothing more than a heap of flesh and bone. He should have felt something, relief, closure, victory. But all he felt was emptiness. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve, smearing red across his skin. His hands were still shaking, his heart still hammering in his chest. The rage that had carried him through this night was gone, leaving behind only exhaustion. His mind raced through what had just happened, through what came next. He had crossed a line that could never be undone. There was no redemption, no turning back. A distant sound broke through his thoughts. Sirens. Faint at first, but growing louder. Someone had heard. Someone had called. He stood there, frozen, staring at the front door as the reality of his actions began to settle around him. It was over. He had nothing left. Not his wife, not his children, not even his faith. His knees gave out, and he sank to the floor beside Franklin's body. His hands found the Bible that had fallen from the table in the struggle, its pages now stained with the blood of the man who had twisted everything sacred in his life. He traced the cover absent-mindedly, the weight of his sins pressing down on him like a crushing tide. The red and blue lights flashed against the walls through the window. Shadows danced as the cars pulled up, tires screeching against the pavement. The voices of officers shouting commands filled the air, but Malcolm barely heard them. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply. The front door burst open. Boots pounded against the wooden floor. Guns were raised, pointed at him, but he didn't move. He simply sat there, the knife still in his hand, the Bible resting against his knee. One of the officers shouted at him to put his hands up. Malcolm lifted his bloodied palms, his voice steady when he spoke. "It's done." The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his wrists as they forced him to his feet. The whispers of the past clung to him like ghosts, the weight of everything he had lost settling into his bones. They led him outside, the night air sharp against his skin. He didn't resist. He didn't fight. He had already lost. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with murmurs and judgment. Cameras lined the back wall, their lenses capturing every moment, every flicker of emotion on Malcolm's face. The world had turned its eyes to him. The fallen pastor, the man who had once stood at the pulpit preaching forgiveness, now sitting in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists bound in chains. The weight of his crimes pressed down on him, but he did not bow. He sat upright, expression unreadable as the trial began. The prosecution painted a brutal picture. A man consumed by rage, methodical in his vengeance. They showed pictures, played recordings, recounted every violent detail. They called it premeditation, a calculated act of murder, fueled by a darkness no faith could cleanse. They made sure the jury saw not the man Malcolm had been, but the monster he had become. His defense was weak. They spoke of betrayal, of unbearable pain, of a man pushed beyond his limits. They tried to make the jury see the devastation that had led him here. But it wasn't enough. The facts were undeniable. 2 bodies, 2 murders. A man who had once spoken of salvation now drowning in his own sins. In the crowd, Malcolm caught sight of his daughter, Jasmine. She sat still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes, once full of warmth, now held only distance. She didn't cry. She didn't look away. She didn't speak. She was the only one of his children who had come, the only one willing to face what he had done. But she had nothing to say to him. The verdict came swiftly. The courtroom fell silent as the judge's voice rang out, each word sealing Malcolm's fate. Guilty. A life sentence. No parola. No second chance. No redemption. The gavel struck, final and unyielding. The whispers in the courtroom erupted into chaos. Malcolm barely heard them. His gaze remained fixed on Jasmine, but she didn't move. She simply stared at him for a long, agonizing moment before standing and walking away. He wanted to call out to her, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. She was already gone. Thank you for watching this powerful story of betrayal, faith, and consequences. What would you have done in Malcolm's place? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts and reflections on this emotional and gripping story. We want to hear your opinion. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, so you won't miss our most captivating videos. Make sure to like the video and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss any of our stories.